The amount of time it takes to meet merger compliance requirements in the U.S. would skyrocket if regulators move forward with a rulemaking proposal. The FTC and the Department of Justice proposed a redesign to the current process, which was created under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Antitrust Improvements Act of 1976. On average, the FTC estimates that the changes would add more than 100 hours of work if the proposal were adopted. To get a better idea on what the proposed changes entail and a bit of a history lesson on the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, the Pipeline recently spoke with Kara Kuritz, a partner in the Vinson Elkins Antitrust practice. I'm Joe Mantone, an editor with S&P Global Market Intelligence, and up next is my conversation with Kara Kuritz. Kara, I certainly want to get into the proposed changes and how they would impact the M&A process, but before we do, can you give an overview on what the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act is and why was it put in place and what are some of the notable requirements?
It's a statute that was enacted in 1976. And what it really does is it requires that parties to an acquisition, both on the buy side and the sell side, submit a notification form to the government when they're doing a deal or making an acquisition of a certain size. It's the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice. The notification goes to both of those agencies. And then the act also requires the parties to observe a waiting period. So they submit the filing, they have to wait to close their transaction for a certain period of time while the antitrust agencies review their transaction. That's at a high level what the HSR Act does. Why was it enacted? Because around the time that it was proposed, there was no notification regime in place. So the federal antitrust agencies would find out about a transaction after it had already closed, and then they would challenge transactions that they thought were anti-competitive in court and unwind a deal that had already integration had already taken place and the eggs had been scrambled already, so to speak. So it was a lot more difficult to unwind a transaction that had already occurred. And the thinking was that by having this notification regime in place, you could challenge transactions before they closed.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. I could imagine that being pretty problematic to unwind a deal after it had already closed. You mentioned that deals of a certain size are required. So, what size deals?
There are thresholds in the Act itself, and they adjust on a yearly basis. The current threshold is 111.4 million. That's the lowest sort of size of the deal threshold that would trigger an HSR.
Would you say that the HSR Act has been effective in helping government entities regulate mergers?
Absolutely. It does what the Act had set out to do. And by requiring this notification regime, and the agencies currently get thousands of HSR filings a year. So I think in fiscal year 2021, over 3,000 HSR filings were submitted to the agencies. And really, the way I think about it is that at the time the Act was put into place, I'm not sure that Congress at the time really knew how many transactions would be captured by the statute. I think maybe they thought it would be less, but the the compromise that was struck was that HSR would apply very broadly to all sorts of different kinds of transactions, whether they raised competitive issues or not. But it would be a relatively simple filing, right? So it's a notification regime. You get notifications about all transactions, but then the form itself would not be that burdensome. I think that was the original goal behind both the act and then how the agency structured the HSR rules and regulations to enact the statute.
Have we seen many changes to the HSR Act over the last nearly 50 years?
So there have been changes to the act, the type of information that's required in the form. Probably the most recent notable one was in 2011. The agencies decided to require more information about entities that are under common control with the filing person or managed by the same investment managers. And really, this got to some of the issues around investment funds and gathering some additional information about other entities in the structure. That change came about in 2011, and there have been other periodic changes, some of them administrative, some of them more substantive, but that's the last more significant change to the HSR regime.
Okay. And so obviously now we have a new proposal on the table. Why are the agencies making these changes now?
So that's a really good question. I think there's a perception at the agencies now and under the Biden administration that the information that they get under the current HSR rules with the form is insufficient to allow them to really assess all the potential competitive implications of a transaction. The agencies have broadened the type of information that they're interested in, including information on labor market, information about foreign subsidies and how those might affect competition. And those are categories of information that weren't previously required or haven't been required under the HSR regime to date.
Antitrust, that's sort of been a priority of the Biden administration, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a really significant executive order that came out in 2021 that sort of laid out all the antitrust priorities and of the Biden administration, and certainly the agencies have made aggressive enforcement a priority.
So was the HSR proposal consistent with what we've seen from regulators recently, or was it a bit of a surprise?
So I think the breadth of the changes is a bit of a surprise, but the fact that the agencies want to make changes is maybe less of a surprise. And there was a notice of proposed rulemaking, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that came out, I think it was last year, or maybe even the year before, that kind of asked a lot of questions about HSR. And I think practitioners have known that this is something that the agencies have been looking at and thinking about, but not necessarily what the changes would actually be.
I know you mentioned some of them already, but can you dive into some of the more significant changes in the proposal?
Yeah, there are quite a few, so I'll try to take them in categories. The first one I'll talk about is the kinds of documents that are required to be submitted with the filing. Right now, the HSR form requires the parties to submit certain transaction specific documents, documents that talk about markets and competition. And these are usually documents that are created by the investment makers who are involved in the transaction, the confidential information memoranda, management presentations, board decks, those kind of analyses that talk about who the company's competitors are, what the market looks like. And those all get submitted with the HSR filing today, but you only have to submit final versions that went to the board or drafts that went to the board. The new proposal would cover all draft documents. It would cover certain ordinary course documents, so documents that are not specific to the transaction, foreign translations of documents. So if a document was written in a foreign language, that now has to be translated in the form. That's a new requirement. And it broadens the scope of the people who are covered by this. So typically, you would only have to produce documents that have gone to officers and directors. Now it's deal team leads as well. And it's not entirely clear what the definition of a deal team lead will be.
So anything that an investment banker had provided to the board during the course of the process has to be submitted.
Yeah, if it touches on the topics that I mentioned, markets, competition, market share, those kind of topics, yes. But drafts that never made it to the board would not have to be submitted. And now the agencies are saying we want every single draft. So early drafts of those presentations, if they were seen by an officer at the company, a lot of times you have documents going back and forth between the investment bankers and the company, and they're reviewing and revising and thinking about the best way to present things. And the agencies are saying they want every draft.
And what's sort of the thinking behind that? Do you know?
I think for some time there's been concern at the agencies that competitive information that they would otherwise learn is getting scrubbed out of those documents as they get more finalized. But so does information that is inaccurate or not quite right. It will be difficult for the agencies to look at those draft documents and know, okay, well, is this really what the company thought? Or is this, just an early draft and the view evolved over time?
I can see how that could be challenging. How about another category of changes?
So the other big one I want to touch on is narrative responses. So right now, the HSR form is fairly objective. You submit a description of the transaction, how it's structured, who the entities are. You provide certain financial information and certain information about the entities that are controlled on each side of the transaction. The proposal is really moving a lot closer to what foreign antitrust regulators do in that they require narrative responses. So you've got to explain to the agencies, these are the areas of overlap. These are the supply relationships or licensing agreements that the parties have. This is the strategic rationale for the transaction. Here's what the timeline of the transaction will look like. So you've got to draft a lot of written responses that are subjective, right? They're not objective as the information that goes into the HSR form today. Now, when you think about, okay, maybe we're moving closer to what Europe or China do with their notification regimes, you have to keep in mind those regimes have short forms for transactions that are unlikely to raise competitive problems, whereas the proposed rules would apply broadly to all transactions, regardless of whether they're likely to pose competitive issues or not. And those regimes have a pre-notification period. So you're going back and forth with the agency, often months before you ever submit or you get to submit your filing. They accept your filing. We don't have that kind of process in the US. The way it currently works is you submit your HSR filing, both parties, buy side, sell side, and that starts the HSR waiting period, right? There's no sort of pre-consultation period that typically happens. And if we're moving in that direction, as I mentioned, that's a months long process. So it's really a big change.
Sure, yeah. And so is the narrative, is it similar to something that we would see in the S4, like the merger background document?
So, for example, there's a competitive overlap section where you would have to provide to the agencies exactly which products or services or prospective products and services where the buyer and the seller would both be offering competitive products or services. But you also have to provide who their top 10 customers are and contact information for those customers. That's the kind of information that would typically go in when the agencies start to investigate.
Right. That's not in the S4.
Yeah, right. Usually what happens, you submit your HSR filing, the agencies reach out with questions if they have questions, and you would provide that information, right? That would be one of the first questions that you would get from the FTC or the DOJ. Okay, explain to us where the overlaps are. Tell us who your top customers are so we can reach out to them and get their reactions about the deal. But that's only for the few transactions that the agencies actually investigate out of the thousands of HSR filings that they get a year. And when you submit that customer contact information to the agencies, okay, they're going to be reaching out to our customers now. So we can't preserve confidentiality to the extent that we could prior to that moment, right? This information is going in with the HSR form. So I think it also is the confidentiality expectations.
Can you explain a little bit more the concerns there about confidentiality?
Yeah, so the HSR form and contents are kept confidential by the agencies. So, if you're doing a deal and you're concerned about it leaking, sometimes parties file their HSR filings before the deal is signed. So, if you're concerned about the deal leaking and you want to do your HSR filing because there's some timing issue, today you can do that and you can have a reasonable expectation that the deal will stay confidential. But once the agencies start reaching out to customers, you can't prevent the deal from leaking, right? So they're going to have that information up front with the HSR form for all transactions. And, as a result, I think parties can't expect anymore that their deal will stay confidential once they make an HSR filing.
Got it. Makes sense. Were there other categories that you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, there's labor market information, foreign subsidies information about the structure on the buy side, particularly. I think this will have a big impact on investment funds. Information about minority holders, disclosing all the 5% limited partners in a fund, for example, org charts, information about lenders and parties who don't have voting securities in the company, which is a new focus. Information about directors and board observers and what other boards they have served on for the past 2 years. I think for public companies, they may be able to provide some of that information, but for non-public companies, that's information that they typically don't track or don't track systematically. And if you think about a fund with lots of portfolio companies, those portfolio companies have subsidiaries, those will have boards, multiple member boards. You're trying to figure out for all of those who the board members are, how long they served on the board, what other boards they've served on. I mean, there's just a lot of information encapsulated there. And then the other point I'll touch on is there's an expansion of the certification requirement. So right now, an officer of the company is required to certify that under penalty of perjury that the information in the HSR form is accurate. And there's an added requirement in the proposed rule that they've also taken steps to retain documents, prevent any documents about the transaction from being destroyed. Implementing those procedures, depending on what kind of systems the company has in place, can be quite costly. Let me just give you an example off the top of my head. If you have a messaging system that you use within the company, but you don't retain those documents for those communications. Let's say you retain them for a month and then they go away, but if you want to access them back further in time, you need a special license from the company. That license can be costly, right? And it's something that the agencies are requiring you to implement up front before. The typical standard is once you anticipate litigation, you have to start retaining documents before there's any anticipation of litigation.
So you're talking about like IMs and chats type things?
Yes, you have to disclose messaging systems that the company uses to the agencies in the HSR form. That's under the proposed rule. And then whoever certifies the filing has to say that they've taken steps or implemented procedures to preserve those documents and prevent any destruction.
Wow, that is a lot of document retention. You mentioned that it's going to be more costly, but it also seems like it's just going to be a lot more time consuming. Any idea on how much more time it would take to meet these proposed requirements?
In the rulemaking itself, the FTC estimates that it will take up to 200 and some hours of additional preparation time. So the way that the rulemaking sets out that they've estimated this is by talking to people at the agencies who have previously prepared HSR forms in private practice. I think that they'll be thinking about legal time, but not necessarily the company's time or the investor's time, right? And gathering this information, maintaining it. Right, if this becomes the standard of information that you have to produce to the FTC, you've got to put compliance procedures in place so that you're tracking all this information. And then I really think what I was talking about earlier with narrative responses, drafting those, gathering information for those, and maybe having hopefully some back and forth with the agency over those so that you can make sure they're complete and your filing is not going to be rejected by the agencies because something that they view as necessary is not included there, right? I just think that it's going to take a significant amount of time.
Yeah, so 200 hours, from the legal perspective. So what does it normally take?
Right now, to do an HSR filing, it usually takes a week or two of preparation time. Most agreements would say, that you would have to file within 5 or 10 business days after the deal signing. That's a common deadline for doing this, and you would start preparing the filing shortly before signing or immediately after signing if you've got 2 weeks. And that would be, sufficient time to gather the information for the HSR form.
So it's like 40 to 80 hours roughly, right?
Yeah, I would think that's right in terms of actual legal time, right? So it's a significant difference.
And then you're saying the time that added for the company will be immeasurably more than that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you think about, again, you're an investment fund, you've got multiple portfolio companies within a fund, you're disclosing all this information about who serves on the boards of all of those portfolio companies, what other boards those officers or board observers serve on. You're thinking about who are all the minority holders of those entities. It really is a vast amount of information, and information that isn't being tracked in any systematic way today.
So what has the reaction been from your clients and others around the deal-making community?
I think clients are genuinely concerned about the additional burden that this will, if enacted as proposed, the burdens that this would impose on trying to get a deal filed and cleared by the FTC and the DOJ. The rulemaking itself does acknowledge that they understand that this is going to be burdensome for some people, for some filing parties, and it requests comment on that. But the agency's view as expressed in the rulemaking is that this is the information that we need to adequately do our job. I think that, again, going back to what we started the conversation with, which is why was the HSR regime enacted? What compromises were made at the time? What were the goals? I really think this is very much moving away from the original intent, which was a notification regime for all kinds of transactions above a certain dollar threshold, but limited information, enough that would allow the agencies to say, hey, we're interested in this deal, let's go ask more questions, but not so much as to say, okay, we're going to do our whole investigation based on the HSR filing up front. I don't think that was ever the intent behind the act.
Obviously, we're going to get a bunch of comment letters from the industry. I mean, but can there also maybe be either legal challenges or can there be another avenue to prevent the proposal from taking place?
The act gives the agencies, the FTC in particular, broad ability to enact rules and regulations to support the mission of the HSR Act. But to the extent that there are arguments that this really goes beyond what the HSR Act is intended to cover, I think we can foresee some legal challenges. Again, if the rulemaking goes into effect as proposed.
Okay, so maybe that's something down the road we'll look for. Trying to think about the possible sunny side to this. If the agencies are getting this information up front, might it lead to a quicker deal approval process?
I think that's possible for some transactions. So I think it's possible that a transaction where the agencies would do a really thorough investigation and would request all of this information, getting that information sooner in the hands of staff who's doing the investigation could speed that along. However, that's a very small segment of all the transactions that are notified under the HSR Act, right? We talked about how there's 3,000 some filings a year, and the agencies investigate less than 5% of those transactions. Now, the agencies might argue that that's because we don't know all the information to investigate more transactions, but I generally think that the agencies get it right. that they do a good job of reviewing the HSR filings that come in and identifying the transactions that are most likely to raise competitive issues.
So more transactions could end up getting investigated if they have more information, you think?
I think that's possible. I think that's part of the agency's goal. But what I would focus on too is that you're getting a larger volume of information for lots of transactions. And so there's also just a volume problem, right? The agencies have got to go through that information for every single deal. And I think because that's so many deals compared to the ones that they actually investigate, that's a significant cog in the machine, if you will, just the volume of information that they'll get, needing to review that information for every transaction.
Right. It could create a backlog.
That's right.
Okay. Oh, do you have any predictions on how do you think this proposal will all shake out?
So I talked a little bit about the changes in 2011. Those were fairly modest changes compared to these, but that process took a year for the agencies to implement. So right now we're within this comment period, and there will be whatever comments that the agencies receive. Well, they'll have to respond to, review and respond to those comments. I think the rulemaking does ask several times for comments on how burdensome the information being requested would be, that they're really interested in understanding that and making sure that the process is not too burdensome versus the benefit of getting this information. I do think that there will be some changes to this proposal as it goes through the comment period and then as the FTC responds to the comments prior to us getting to a final rule.
So maybe limiting the number of deals that are subjected to the final rule?
Yeah, I could foresee maybe that being one way the agencies go. They could also say, we want to keep this sort of wide net that we've cast under the HSR Act and getting notifications for all these transactions, but maybe some of the information we can tailor a little bit better to make it less burdensome on filing parties.
Well, we'll see how it all plays out. And for those who are interested, there is now more time to comment on the proposal. After we spoke with Kara, the FTC extended the comment period deadline until late September. In the meantime, we thank Kara for joining us and providing all of her insight. And that will do it for this episode of The Pipeline. Thanks for listening.